Otherwise, we might have tried to reschedule this had we known it would be such a small group, but we really want to keep moving, so we are going to get started. Just a warning, the meeting is recorded, so any of your tacky comments will be there for posterity, so just keep that in mind.
Not video, is it?
It's not video, no. You didn't have to dress up.
I was thinking about it.
The main purpose of this meeting, and it's mainly going to be the Richard show, the main purpose of this meeting is to say, are we on the right track and can we move forward? That's really, and Richard will go through some of the changes we want to make to Task 2, and we want to get the committee's blessing to move forward with those changes. It's kind of the main purpose of the meeting. Just a reminder that as things get posted on the portal, it's important to timely respond so that when we have a meeting like this, we've already had the comments, and you'll see that we've got responses already done by Corolla to the comments that were received. And then our discussion today is going to be limited to only the committee members, the few of us that are here, because they've seen the draft and made the portal comments, and they need to make the direction about going forward. Let's go around the room and introduce committee members, and then I'll have Richard start and introduce the Corolla members. I'm Maureen George, chair of this august committee.
Wade Noble from Yuma.
Virginia O'Connell, Arizona Water Banking Authority. But I just want to note, too, I don't want to look rude. I do need to leave at noon, so anyway, just thought I'd throw that out.
Jerry Walker, ADWR.
Cindy Rule, ADWR.
Warren Tenney with Arizona Municipal Water Users Association, and I need to be ruder than Virginia and leave a little before 11.
Will you stay until 11?
Okay, Richard.
I'm Richard Humphreys with Corolla Engineers, and I'd like to introduce some of my team members on this project. We've got Juliet McKenna from Montgomery & Associates, and then we have Jim Tress from Western Resources, and then we have Rupal Pandya from Corolla Engineers. And
good to go. Okay, so I think, Richard, you're on.
okay. Well, I'd just like to express appreciation to begin with for the feedback you've given us on the tech memo, and also feedback we've received through ADWR on the project to date. And I also want to express appreciation for our team members here. I've come to really appreciate their contributions. They have experiences that are different from ours, and so they're great sounding boards, and they have lots of great ideas that they've contributed to the work that we've done so far. So,
Richard, if I could take a moment, Sarah Porter just joined us, just so we have that on the record.
okay. Welcome, Sarah.
Yeah, would you like to introduce yourself, who has joined us on the phone?
Hi, it's Holly Richter with the Nature Conservancy. I'm sitting in for Scott Deeney today.
Thanks, Holly.
Great, thanks, Holly.
Thank you. And there's also Tony DeMarco.
Yeah, Tony DeMarco from CAP.
Great, thank you.
And Chris Wright from Western Resources is also on the phone.
Did you get that, sir?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sleepers. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Now I think we're good. Okay, Richard, sorry to interrupt.
Okay. Thank you. So with this presentation today, what we're hoping to accomplish, first of all, is to bring closure to Task 1, get your approval to move on to Task 2 and some of the next things we've got on the project. We also want to develop some consensus on the approach we want to take with Task 2, and then we have a list of decisions that we would like to get the committee's approval on that reflect the direction that we're hoping to go going forward now. So just to summarize some of the key parts of the scope, this table here lists the various water augmentation options that we were provided and that we were asked to look at and see how we could implement these water augmentations throughout the state. And so we have taken these at face value and have begun to work with them. And then this table was also provided to us with the original scope of work which lists the various evaluation factors that the committee and ADWR are suggesting be used for this. And so we've taken those also at face value, and then as we are going through, there will be some tweaks that we are going to suggest with this. This table here summarizes the key tasks and deliverables of the project scope. And I put this up here along with the next slide that I'm going to show you, where you can show you the adjustments that we are suggesting to the scope. And these are not ones that require any budget change or anything like that. It's just some adjustments that we think are useful to help us accomplish the objective of this project, which at the end of the project will be to have a list of augmentation projects that we present to the committee for your review, and then the committee will select 3 to 5 of those projects for some additional analysis that will be documented in the final report. So the adjustments that we're suggesting are highlighted in the orangish color, and primarily it is to put a focus on developing water augmentation projects to a level of detail where we have the information needed to run through the evaluation process that is defined in the Category 1, 2, and 3 evaluations that are documented in Tech Memo 1. And in the process of going up to this point in the project, we've identified several areas for the evaluations where we are suggesting some adjustments, and although we don't have specific ones, we think that there are going to be more as we get projects defined, and we ask ourselves, well, how are we going to evaluate these, and how are we going to compare Project A with Project B to determine which one might be the most beneficial. And so we are suggesting that we relook at the criteria at the end of Task 2 based on what we've learned and give you some recommendations based on that. We'll still prepare a technical memorandum and do a workshop like we are today at the end of Task 2. And then Task 3, rather than just using the Category 2 evaluation, we'll look at Category 1 and Category 2 at the end of Task 3. And so that's just the shifting that we're suggesting, and I wanted you to know what that is up front, so that as we go through the detail of Tech Memo 1 and a discussion about what we're hoping to accomplish, hopefully this context will make sense to you. Do you have any questions about this right now, or do you want to just wait till we go through the detail with the rest of the presentation?
Well, yeah, I think keep going.
Okay, we'll keep going. So let's look at technical memorandum. Number 1, we've provided that to you, so I'm assuming you've had a chance to look at it. So I'm just going to provide an overview that maybe will focus on how we got to where we did and what some of the results are. There are 3 major components to Technical Memorandum 1. The first one is to provide definitions of each of the water augmentation options so that we have a common basis for, when we refer to that, hopefully we all have a similar understanding of what that augmentation option means. The second step was to complete a high-level evaluation, and the intent of that was to look at all of the augmentation options by planning area and then ask ourselves the question, are there some that we know immediately are not viable that we could cross off without doing further analysis? And so we completed that exercise. As you'll see, it was based on a set of assumptions. Some of those assumptions may not be the direction we want to get to it going forward, and I'll talk about that when we get to that point. And then we are to develop scoring and weighting criteria for each of the various evaluation methods. So we'll start with the definitions, and I don't think we need to go through each of them in detail, but I do want to point out in the packet that you have here, we took the comments that we received, and we had a lot of good comments. There's about 132 of them. Many of them are related to the definitions, and so we took them and then we put a response to them. And rather than go to it in item by item, I thought we would put them there. If any of you have any questions about them or objections or comments, you can certainly let us know. We accepted the vast majority of them. There are some that we would have some adjustments to. And so our response then to the definition descriptions is all documented in this document. The next is the high-level evaluation, and this is in the tech memo, and as you can see, it's a big table. There's a lot of information there, and if you think this one was big, you should have seen what we started with before we got to this one. And I don't think we need to necessarily go through each one of them, but let me just tell you a couple things about this that have perhaps changed in our thinking. When we started doing this, our mindset was we need to get down to 3 to 5 projects, and maybe one of the ways to do that is have minimum thresholds. For example, a community that might do reclaimed water project of some sort, you know, maybe we'll have a minimum threshold for that, and we did that on several of those. That's one of the things that I think we're suggesting would be superseded, because as you will see a little bit later on, water conservation or reclaimed water is something that can be implemented at any community that chooses to do that if they have a water reclamation plant. And so I'll show you a little bit later how we envision handling some of those. And so a number of the minimum thresholds that we had defined as a part of the augmentation option descriptions are not necessarily the ones that we're going to use as boundaries going forward. I know some of you had some comments on the tech memo related to that, and hopefully that will address some of the concerns or comments that you had. So, as you can see, just in looking at what boxes have something in and which ones don't, there were a number that we were able to remove from consideration. And there we received 1 or 2 comments or 3 about some of those that they were questioned, and 1 or 2 of them we went back and looked, and it probably makes us sense to make an adjustment on those. So then let's move on to the next task, which is a scoring and weighting criteria. So we had categories 1, categories 2, and categories 3 is defined in the scope. So we took the various evaluation factors for each of those, and then as a team, we debated and discussed and brainstormed to come up with what we think might be criteria associated with each of those evaluation factors. And so the criteria notes section is that the listing of all of those we have down there. And just for the sake of space on the PowerPoint presentation, there was another column for notes that I took out. Then we decided on a scoring, and the intent was to score them based on a 1, 2, and 3 numbering, and then that scoring would be multiplied by the weighting that we laid out to come up with a ranking, which I also took off just for the sake of space on the PowerPoint. And this is another area where, after thinking about it a little bit more, some of our thoughts have changed. We went with a 1 to 5 weighting, and the reason that we did that was if you have 10, you know, what's really the difference between a 3 and a 4, and do we have enough information and detail to score something based on that granularity? And so that's why we went with a 5. And the reason we went from a 1 or 0 to 3 on the scoring was the idea, again, that this is a very high-level evaluation, and we wanted to be able to just identify, you know, what's feasible and what's not at this level. I took this scoring and I took some of the augmentation options and I ran them through this process, and one of the things that I discovered after I did my own scoring was, okay, one option might have a score of, you know, 35, another one might have a scoring of 41, for example, and I was asking myself, well, does that really do enough to differentiate? Can we eliminate some projects based on that scoring? And there was some question in my mind as to whether or not we were going to be able to do that as much as we were hoping for. I don't have changes to recommend to you here at this point, but one of the ideas we've thought about is, what if we're scoring projects and based on some understanding or insight we need, you know, we really want to be able to highlight one or possibly knock one out of the running with the scoring, and for that reason it might be advantageous to change the weighting to go from 1 to 10, for example. But we'll give you more feedback on that once we've developed the projects. And there are some of the evaluation factors where, in looking at them, we thought at the time, well, we're not going to have the information to do that in Category 1, let's put it to Category 3, and vice versa. So we did have some suggestions of changes that we would make. We may make additional changes later, but those are some of the things that we found in putting this together initially and then testing it a little bit to see how it works. So, and this is Category 1. We've got Category 2 evaluation criteria, and the intention of Category 2 is to be at a little bit more detailed level. So there's a little bit of overlap in some of the evaluation factors, for example, environmental. And when we came up with the criteria and notes, we were trying to say, well, okay, what are the questions we want to ask at Category 1, and then maybe some different questions at Category 2, and so on. And some of them, such as the local issues, we broke that down into a number of different areas that could be issues. We aren't going to weight local issues differently than ability to score them. So all of those local issues would be reduced to one local issue score that is then weighted, the way we currently envisioned doing this. And then Category 3 is even more detailed, and that's the level where we would try and put together costs. We would look more at economic viability, and so we would have some scoring in those areas to help differentiate what projects really would be the 3 to 5 that the committee might choose to go forward with. So our thoughts on Tech Memo 1 is it was very useful for us to go through the exercise, very useful to work with ADWR and work through differences in expectations and understandings and figure out how to do this as a team. And so we feel we gained a lot from going through that process and realizing that the high-level evaluation and the evaluation criteria could easily change as we go to subsequent steps. One of the things that we were going to suggest is perhaps we leave this at this stage as a draft document rather than a finalized one that would become public. Use it as an important milestone on the project and then focus on the next steps that we have in Task 2 that we're going to talk about next.
I could interrupt there for a minute because I know Bruce came in a little late on this.
All right.
Well, no, that's fine, but it's okay. You missed all the things about the meeting recorded, so don't say anything you don't want me to. But the idea here is that we would leave technical memorandum 1 as a draft, because as we get more information, we may need to go back and change some of the things in one, you know, as we get more information.
Yeah.
That the first pass, this looks like that accurate description of whatever.
And I found a lot of information in this first draft. It would be good to have a long discussion between all of us on a lot of the information, because some of it is, I just think a lot of it's qualitative, not quantitative, and I want to make sure that we're all on the same page.
Right, and I think, Richard, one of the things we're going to get into in 2 is the kind of changing from quantitative to qualitative analysis of some of this, because we were not really getting where we needed to get.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
So let's jump into the next section, which is preparations for task number 2. And the first thing I'd like to discuss with you is we took the augmentation options and I sat down with the scoring and weighting information that we prepared, and I said, well, what does this look like? And as we took the augmentation options by themselves without further definition, as you can see from this table, there were a lot of the different categories and the criteria that we weren't able to score because the information just wasn't there. And then I also looked and I said, okay, the ones that are yes, why can I score them? What's different about them? And one of the things is issues like conservation, aquifer recharge, direct potable reuse, and brackish desalination. Those are things that I've worked with on projects in the past, and so I already know a lot about them. They're fairly easy to quantify, and so as I scored them, in reality I had project definitions in my mind from work that I'd already done previously. And somebody else with a different set of life experiences may look at some of these others and be able to change them to yeses based on their evaluation with their set of work experiences. But the bottom line is just looking at that, you know, even though we may have different perceptions on which box is a yes and which box is a no, the bottom line is we can't uniformly score all of them with just an augmentation option because we don't have enough detail or information to be able to score them to go on to the next step. And so that's when we started looking at, well, how can we adjust and do this in a different way to be able to achieve the objectives of the project. And the same thing with category 2. I didn't put a table up there, but the answer is really the same, that we don't have the information for the category 2 evaluation also. So then I thought, well, let's just look at this from a different angle and see what it is we can do. We know that it's very important for the committee to be able to do something in every planning area, and you particularly want to provide opportunities outside of the active management areas. And so I said, well, what if we looked at each of those planning areas with an understanding of what is there, what are the issues in that area, and then go back to the list of augmentation options and say which ones make sense. Now that immediately significantly reduces the number of options, because before it was 22 planning areas times 22 options, which is a really big number and too many to evaluate in any level of detail. But if we look at each of these planning areas and say what are the most important 1 or 2 or 3 projects that could be defined, and those projects may include 1 or multiple augmentation options put together in some form or another to come up with a list of augmentation options. And so that immediately takes us from over 400 to, you know, somewhere between 22 and let's say 66 projects to go over in a little bit more detail. And so that to us made sense as a way to tackle it. and allow us to go deeper in developing projects and evaluate them that we might have been able to do otherwise. So that's, okay, so that's one suggestion that we have. And there are a couple others also. But just from that one, if we take all the planning areas, and this is just a brief brainstorming list, so it's not my intention that this be the list of what we go forward with, but just based on, 10 or 15 minutes and what I knew about what could be done in some of these different planning areas, I wrote down some types of projects that we could do. So there's a couple planning areas where it appeared to me that we need to do some agriculture conservation. There's others that brackish groundwater is perhaps a good option to look at. And then the very bottom one of the other messages we've heard is that the committee would also be interested in projects that provide benefits for multiple planning areas and is maybe a bigger type of a project. And so, one brainstorm for that is, what if we went over to California to any of the water companies over there that take CAP water, Colorado River water, and they use it in their system? What if we constructed a very large desalination facility? It would have to be large to get their attention and interest, and then worked out some sort of an exchange so that rather than deliver Colorado River water there in California, maybe we would take that water and use it in whichever planning areas could be physically connected where we could get water to them. And we could do a similar kind of thing in Mexico as well. So, and as you can see, there are planning areas that I don't have a particular project defined immediately. We're going to have to do some research. But this is also an area where we would be interested in input from the committee. Because, go ahead.
Right. It seems to me the strategic vision did this exercise, and I'm curious to what extent did you make reference to that? I think there's a chart in that document that shows these are the likely options and the not likely options for each planning area.
Are you talking about the document that goes through each planning area?
GWAC's
okay.
strategic vision from late 2014.
We have used that, and we've pulled information from that in our analysis. We haven't yet gone to the point of trying to combine several of those to create a project, but that's a good idea. That's another one we should look at again to see.
Because I think that was largely informed by the previous...
The WRDC.
WRDC. I mean, there's a lot, not completely, but there's a lot of it. I think of it as the Skunk Works filter on the WRDC. So anyway, it just seems like really good thinking.
Okay, that's a good point. So, given that everyone in this room has different experiences and perspectives, one of the things that we would like the committee to provide some guidance and help on is tell us about the needs that you know of, or where you think we could really make a difference with a water augmentation project in some part of the state, so that we can take and define that in greater detail and run it through the evaluation process and compare it with other options. There are also some of the augmentation options on the list that maybe we can look at them in a different way. And these are three: municipal conservation, aquifer recharge with treated recycled water, and then potable reuse. And I don't think these are necessarily the only three, but this is a starting place for thinking about them. What if we took and created a project description for these that said, if we take conservation, for example, there's the information that AEWR has, there's information that cities have put together. There's a lot of information out there. We can put together a package that we're going to call a municipal water conservation description, and then AEWR could take that to anybody in any planning area, anywhere where there's a community where there's opportunity for conservation of any size. That's a viable way. There's really no downside to conservation that I can see, and it can be applied anywhere. So why don't we just do that rather than trying to apply conservation to just one planning area or a couple planning areas. The same thing goes with the reclaimed water. We could come up with a project description for aquifer recharge, and what I'm envisioning is this would be down to, but not including the municipal level. So this definition or project description can talk about this is how you can use reclaimed water, and maybe you at the city level would need to make some choices as to whether or not you do direct potable reuse, aquifer storage and recovery, or if you have a good application for it, whether it's a mining or an agricultural application where that water can be reused. And that again can apply then to any of the planning areas, any community that has a water reclamation facility. And that's where, going back to my earlier statements about the high-level evaluation, that's where I'm thinking this is one place where this approach sort of supersedes what we did in the high-level evaluation. I think there may be potential for some other ones. There was the augmentation option to deal with runoff. Urban runoff could be another possibility for this. Brackish groundwater may be another one that could apply to many different planning areas where we come up with a good project description that could be used by any planning area that has brackish groundwater. And doing that also then simplifies the number of projects that we have to compare and evaluate, because it just makes sense to apply these across the state. And these project descriptions I'd see as really being in addition to the 3 to 5 that we would end up with in the final report, going all the way through the final selection.
Is it, I think we need to be careful about thinking about the entire state.
Okay.
Versus, like for instance, the AMAs, like conservation, municipal. You know, if you look at water demand in the smaller communities, and I'll look at DWR for verification of this, you know, their water demand's pretty low. You can't squeeze a turn in it.
Right.
And so conservation in those smaller communities outside of the major urban areas may be just system enhancements, reduce loss and unaccountable for water, and make sure that you're metering your water a lot more efficient.
Sure.
And it's not necessarily a conservation program. So I think we need to be careful about trying to take what works in the AMAs and trying to peanut butter that to these other areas that I think a lot of our focus when it comes to long-term augmentation, while we are focusing, I believe, on the major urban areas too.
But sure, it was to get information out there to the rural areas.
We have some major issues associated with those areas outside of the major urban areas. And so something like conservation, I don't know if that's going to work.
Well, it certainly isn't going to do everything by itself.
Well, but yeah, what I don't want to do is put together a report that suggests that, you know, they reduce their demand by 20% or whatever it is, and
when they're
already
already
down 50 gallons per day, capita per day. And so I want to be very, very careful about peanut buttering this, because I don't think, while some of these might work within an AMA or where they have infrastructure, I think it's imperative that we identify where infrastructure is lacking, where they may need infrastructure, where they may need improvements, and where, you know, where from an economic perspective, they don't have the finance to pay for it either.
And as we all know, this has been an elephant that we have struggled to get our hands around, a way to make it from elephant size down to something manageable. And I think I have kind of a similar concern as you, Bruce, with this. And I was not present at all of the committee meetings, and so when you came up with the factors and the criteria, I wasn't there. And so it's largely been my conversations with Maureen about what the intent of this document was. And I think we conveyed that to Richard, and Richard got that we we want to have something that's applicable to all of the planning areas. And so that's kind of what we had looked at those first two tasks. And then recognizing that to have any meaningful evaluation based on a lot of the criteria that the committee identified, we would have to go smaller and smaller and get down to project specific. And we had the concept of scoring and weighting to help us identify what planning areas we really need to focus on, and then which things are more applicable in them. And we arrived where we arrived, and I think the point that you're making is, so municipal conservation should be able to be done in every planning area, so the viability, but the effectiveness of it, or how much volume it would actually save, I think is part of the evaluation. And if we do this peanut buttering, we lose we all know, you can always say, if you have ag, you can do ag conservation. If you have people, you can do municipal conservation. But for the non-AMA areas and their unique situations, how meaningful of an exercise is that? And that's my concern about moving to projects, going too specific right away, because then I think we lose that. And I think that was what we were trying to achieve in that second task was, you have a planning area. We were making it smaller by saying these are viable and these are non-viable, and then looking at those more detailed criteria for the ones that were viable, I think, because you're exactly right. If I walked out to a rural community and said, your number one thing is municipal conservation, they would literally laugh me out of the room. It's like our GPC is 70.
With a pitchfork.
Yeah, chase me out of
even if there were potential, they probably already recognize that and may be working on it, you know. I mean, it isn't helpful. So
but I think
we need a threshold of what's helpful.
I think part of the idea, though, was exactly that on these three, at least. I don't know that I agree with some of the other ones Richard mentioned, but at least on these three, was that they are potentially available in all of the planning areas. Whether they make sense or not is a different, whereas some of the other ones are clearly not available in different planning areas.
Right.
These were the three that came up that at least potentially were available in any planning area, because most of the planning areas, even if some of them don't have wastewater treatment plants, they could. I mean, or we'll eventually have to get there or whatever, or there's usually at least one community in that planning area that does have that. So maybe what it is again, because I think because it is kind of universal in the sense that available, whether it makes sense or not, a different issue, that maybe as part of this definition that they're going to come up with for these three criteria, some of that definition includes some of those parameters. Like assuming your GCPD is more than,
right,
you know, I mean, some parameters to kind of qualitatively let somebody know whether or not that's something that applies to them. Does that, Bruce, go to?
Yeah, if you're more explicit on those kind of items, that, okay, this may not apply, but it could.
Yeah, so within this definition, do some kind of qualitative analysis so that while we're saying these three are theoretically available in any planning area, depending on this criteria, they may not be in yours.
Right.
So you need to look at these things. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. And, you know, with conservation, we could certainly, if we get threshold criteria, it's still going to be arbitrary, you know, but you could also...
Yeah, but I mean, some guidance to those...
It will be not arbitrary, but it won't be perfect. It will be imperfect.
Yes.
It will be thoughtful.
It will.
It won't be
Yes.
just a random number.
You know, if you have a GPCD greater than 150, maybe there's opportunities.
Right, exactly.
No, I was, I might be wrong, but I think when we had talked about adaptability, I thought we were looking more at transferability, like if there was a project that we could do in one planning area, how easy is it to be able to do that in another planning area? And so I guess that's where the conservation...
Right, I think this was an attempt to, we're going to drill down to eventually get to the point where we pick 3 or 5 projects to recommend. The idea was that instead of maybe picking as projects these things, which in theory at least are available everywhere, that we do some qualitative analysis of these 3 things, have these 3 things out there as something all plan areas could look at, and looking at this criteria, figure out if you can use, and then drop down to identifying 1 or 2 or 3 projects in each planning area that are unique to that planning area. Is that more?
Yeah.
So
Go ahead. I was just going to say, that makes sense. That's a good approach to kind of makes it easier for the bigger project that we're really trying to dig in for augmentation, that people really think about when they talk about augmentation. If when we talk though about conservation, there's numerous things that can fall under that category. If we're suggesting these are things you can consider, not that we're recommending that everybody is doing it, but keep it more on some things that deal with their actual systems, like looking at system loss and such, rather than,
less outside landscape.
Or a media campaign, or,
plumbing.
And
just to avoid the perception that we're trying to impose the
AMA requirements on everybody.
On everyone.
Okay.
well, and so that was my thought when you were talking about a new project for you, or a new task would be to develop projects for each of these. That to me sounds very detailed, like you're going to spend a ton of time doing it. And there is so much information on these 3 things everywhere. I don't necessarily think that I don't think it was the intent of this project to spend a significant period of time talking about municipal conservation.
I would agree. I think folks are wanting to hear more or see opportunities in the different planning areas in augmentation, because sometimes you have a hard time explaining that conservation can help with that. It could.
And it's how you define conservation.
Exactly.
I
think that was all part of trying to break these 3 out of the other part, though. Because right now, these 3 are on that list of projects.
Right.
We thought, really,
take them off
that list of projects, do some
general comments
about them in the beginning, and then move on to specific projects, recognizing that in a lot of cases, even if you did these things, it's not going to necessarily give you a lot more water. It may replace a water source. It may give you it might give you another year of use until you have to go get the next drop a bucket. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize these things exist as options, but now let's focus on
I think it even goes farther. There are places in the state where fairly modest yields from these strategies can go a long way, and those are the places that have the hardest time affording augmentation.
Per se, right, the larger projects. Right.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Right. If you can give the Verde Valley 1,000 acre-feet, you could make a big difference in, things that are happening there. So I think that we should recognize that these are important, and maybe the most important strategies in the places that have the hardest time funding fancy augmentation. They may be being implemented, but maybe not.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I didn't mean to imply not to say it at all. I just think
sensitive to the sensibilities of people who are already doing it.
Right, and have it, just say these are ideas. We're not saying you have to do. This is a list of things you could be working on.
Yeah, I see it as a menu of options.
Yeah, my bet is that it isn't going to be news for people, and the people who would pay attention to this memo, and the thing for us to do is just sort of agree that we know it's out there and they're working on it.
Right, and go back to Jory's point, I think, right. I mean, this isn't something that we want Kroll to spend a lot of time on. This is more just, kind of a lot of literature out there just saying lots of different definitions of these things. Generally speaking, they could potentially be available. They could make some small savings that could be significant in certain areas. You may want to consider these things when you're looking at, before you go into the big dollar augmentation project.
So would you agree that ag conservation should be on that list as well?
Yeah, because I mean, I think AG obviously does conservation as well. We have our friends in Yuma who are the poster child for that. So that, yeah, well, and actually, as far as that goes, there's industrial conservation too. So I mean, I think, yeah, we may just want to say, and again, that goes back to, I think, Bruce's and Jory's point about not spending too much time on it, that there are, industry, municipal, industrial, and agricultural standards for conservation. You may want to look at those to see if any of them benefit your area. Kind of not a lot. Yeah, again, going back to, we really want to spend the time on the larger augmentation projects as opposed to these things that are available. We don't want to lose these things. We want to make sure in areas that may not be taking advantage of them that they know they're out there, and then move on to the next one.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Then there are two other augmentation options that are also very different from the rest of them, and so they don't quite fit in the way we would evaluate others because they may not necessarily be specific to a planning area or a municipality. It's harder to quantify the benefits from them, and so we want to ask you, what was your intent and thoughts in these, and how do you think that they could be applied and looked at in this project?
I think weather modification, there's been historic research, but it's still a ongoing modeling. Does it make sense? You can describe it and say you looked at it, but I don't know how pertinent it might be at this stage. Forest restoration, I'm not sure what you would say about that when it comes to augmenting water supplies. It's protecting water supplies. But augmenting, I think, is, ensuring a more healthier ecosystem and watershed are all great things, but I don't know about augmentation.
Yeah. I mean, I think that forests need to be managed and taken good care of. I'm just not sure how we can apply them on this project.
It's not apposite to the exercise here.
So, yeah, and it was on our list of projects that maybe we do, kind of like we did those three, we broke them out to be treated A way. We'll break these two out to be treated B way, and just maybe what we say is continue to monitor,
right, exactly,
development in these areas, and is that?
Agree.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So then, this goes back to my earlier question. What augmentation projects and ideas do you have? What needs do you see? I'm happy to take ideas you have off the top of your head in this meeting, but I also was going to suggest that perhaps, sometime over the next couple of weeks, if you could put down your thoughts and ideas and send them to us in an email, we'd be interested in your input and your feedback.
Okay.
Does anybody anything they want to throw out now, or do we just say we'll submit stuff?
I don't want this to be lost, but they need to maybe invest in infrastructure, especially smaller systems that might need improvements. And I don't know if that's conservation per se, but if pipes need to be fixed and wells need to be improved, those are all good investments, easy investments, and quick return.
We get into the area where we start talking about conservation augmenting.
Yeah.
And that's a little difficult to get there, but on the other hand, you end up with more water.
Yeah.
Right, especially like on the system loss thing and stuff,
it might be an easier sell if you talk about infrastructure improvements or something to that extent. Conservation.
So maybe that can be the target of the conservation comment, is a review of your infrastructure.
Yeah.
And what for example, system losses and what it could yield.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So now,
Richard, the comments should go to you, or who do you want the comments to go to over the next couple of weeks? Ideas.
They come through me.
Okay.
send them to Cindy.
All right.
Or give them to me.
So you can email Cindy if you have any comments in the next couple of weeks, in terms of projects. And when you do that, it might be useful if there's some specific planning areas that you have in mind for those projects to also make that part of what you submit. Great.
So the next 12 slides are all a lot of text. But what we tried to do is identify what are the areas where we look to the committee for decisions in a discrete way, so that in most of them, hopefully you can just say yes or no to them, and then that provides us with the direction that we are looking for from this meeting to go forward.
Okay, and I think the first three we've already covered, because those were the three, or maybe even the first 4 or 5. Actually, I think we've already discussed those 3 that you wanted to break out, the weather mod and the restoration.
Conservation.
Yeah.
Could I have a clarification though for the first one, which is, we don't only mean municipal, we also mean private water systems. So we should be clear about that, because that's where I think a lot of the work could be done.
Well, and also broader, I mean, we've already stated it, but just for ultimate clarity here, we're talking about conservation in the municipal use sector, the agricultural use sector, and, I mean, we can mention the industrial use sector in the write-up, and that it's not necessarily a general project description, but it's more just a brief discussion about what it is, at least with municipal focusing on efficiency and improving efficiencies in infrastructure. So what would you, how long, just to give Richard an idea, how many pages should that be?
20.
No, that we don't want 20.
Page.
No, I think
that's what I was
I'm kind of thinking 1
to 2 pages. Yeah.
Those,
okay.
I mean, and probably a half a page, and probably a half a page for the weather mod and the forest thing, because I think we're basically just saying monitor developments in those areas because they could in the future have an impact.
Right.
Okay.
Help.
All right, so your act number 1 was just conservation that we just discussed. Number 2 was aquifer recharge and recovery that we can treat in a similar manner.
Yeah.
So could I just ask the question, we have the 2 aquifer recharge, we have urban runoff and then treated effluent, which I know is a bad word, but I'm going to say it. So they are different, but the process is largely the same. Obviously the urban runoff, and once again, I'm not quite sure why we broke it out. I think because
we have all those water rights issues about urban runoff.
Okay, so you don't think we can put that with it? You think that one needs to stay and be evaluated separately from other recharge?
Or couldn't we just qualify? I mean, I think there are water rights issues with all of these.
Well, that's true, depending on what, depending, or at least many of them. Maybe not all of them, but certainly many of them, yes.
There may be a return flow obligation or some other thing that's interfering here. So I think we need to just make it clear that we're not making an assessment of the legal availability of this solution.
So is your suggestion recharge, and then you list it?
That's what I was thinking.
That's what I was thinking.
That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that happens a few times in the document. You just classify recharge or conservation or transfers or exchanges, and then you list them all the options within that category.
Okay. And we can do that, and I know that was one of the comments we had on the document, and I was initially hesitant just not knowing exactly where the committee wanted to go on that, but if you want to combine them that way, in some way, then I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Okay.
Because that way, when you're in an area, if aquifer recharge is available, they can look and decide which of those kinds of aquifer recharge makes the most sense for them.
Yeah.
But then we still looked at that as a project for that area.
Yep. Okay. And the third one is direct potable reuse.
And I think that's interesting that you're positing that any system, that it would be a viable solution for any system, because I would think...
Well, certainly there's a minimum threshold size-wise, but...
I think, very costly otherwise. I think it's interesting.
But when you compare the cost of direct potable reuse with wellhead treatment, if you have arsenic nitrates, and particularly with high TDS, it is competitive.
Right, and it's certainly less than bringing in water from the Missouri River or something. I mean, right? I mean, so relatively speaking, it's.
Okay.
I like the idea of having that, approaching it that way.
Okay. All right, we'll proceed on that one then. Non-potable reuse was the other one that I think is very similar.
Right.
Mostly just using irrigation.
Right.
Direct potable reuse, yeah.
And then we talked about number 5 already, weather modification. Just documenting that it's there.
Right, and same with 6.
Yep. 6 is the forest restoration. And then 7, this is the idea of focusing the budget of task 2 on developing and defining these descriptions so that we can then evaluate them and compare them in task 3.
Right, and this is the change because we originally had you. Rich, you want to go just real quickly through that again?
Okay.
What the change is from what it currently says versus what we're proposing here.
Currently, the scope is written to say we would evaluate augmentation options through the Category 1 criteria and then do a tech memo and a workshop. And the change is, let's use task 2 to define projects and descriptions to a level that we can do the evaluation. So, and I'm envisioning only going down to the level of understanding what that would be using the criteria that we've established. Then relook at the criteria for recommendations, and then in task 3, we would evaluate the various projects with the Category 1 and the Category 2 evaluation criteria.
Right. And I think the idea there is we don't really have the information we need to make what was originally the task 2 assessment. So let's spend some more time defining the projects so that it's easier to then compare them.
Yep.
That sounds like a good approach.
So, Richard, let me just ask, so what you would do is, and Tech Memo 1 is just this draft thing, but clearly in some planning areas there are things that are not available. Then we've pulled out this group of ones that we're saying are available. So say for a planning area you have 4 or 5 things that remain on the list that are available. You anticipate then for each planning area picking a number of projects, or were you just thinking one project out of those 5, or one project might cover all 5? Just so we agree with you on what that level will be for each planning area.
I'm envisioning 1 to 3 project descriptions for each planning area, with the idea that once you focus on what's really there, it'll be easy to narrow it down. Each one of those project descriptions could include 1 or more augmentation options. You know, it could be a brackish groundwater desalination, and maybe there's a transportation or an exchange or whatever it could be. So there could be more augmentation options associated with a project. And what I envision the tech memo for task 2 being is having 2 sections. One would be a series of project descriptions where we would, just put together 1 or more tables.
I find this on the web for Siri.
I have a sensitive phone. I'm envisioning a table with a number of different boxes that contain the information we need to evaluate that project against the criteria. And so you will see a series of those in the tech memo. And then we would have, the second section would be whatever recommended changes we have to the Category 1, 2, and 3 evaluation criteria. And that's what we would provide to you.
I think, Richard, one thing, though, is there may, just having thought about the strategic vision for information, for example, I guess it's important, though, that in some areas there may not be that many.
That is correct.
So I mean, I think we want to do the 1 to 3 so that it's very clear that if one is it, then one is it. Or if none is it, other than those general things we've identified, that we're clear about that, because while we want to make this reasonable, we also want to make it realistic. And if, you know, if there really isn't, I guess what I'm saying is, I don't want us to stretch to find a project in each area if there isn't one.
Right.
Other than those general things we've already identified.
Sure.
Gotcha.
Because knowing that is knowledge. I mean,
right.
That somebody has evaluated, somebody external has evaluated that and come to that conclusion.
Right.
We can spend that in a robust way.
Right, and I think that's why, I mean, I think that's one of the advantages of pulling out those 3 general categories, because obviously those are 3, they're at least potentially available in all of the planning areas, so it's not like we're saying there's nothing. And I agree, Sarah, I mean, ideally, there's at least going to be a project for each planning area. I mean, I think we're going to try to find them, but I guess at the same time, I don't want to go overboard, you know, come up with projects just to come up with projects that aren't, right.
If all the stars aligned correctly, and you had $1 gazillion.
Maybe I like, I want to air a concern I have that this could look to some parts of the state like a report that sort of was generated in Maricopa County, and it's telling, so I know ADWR has been working in at least 3 planning areas, maybe more, but I think ADWR should be has important input to provide in terms of recent experience since the strategic vision and what's going on in different planning areas in their thinking, but also is there any way to make sure or to guard against, here's this sort of Maricopa County predominant, you know, study that came out, and you only have the option of, you know, recharging your aquifers. And like, is there any way of making sure that we're consulting with stakeholders in those places, or do we just qualify it?
Kind of the end of this was, I mean, the last thing in this, not part of Corolla's obligation, but was to go out into those planning areas before this became a final document, to make sure that we didn't miss.
I'm a short timer.
Make sure we didn't miss something. And I think that's part of the homework that the Corolla team is going to do as well. I mean, not that they're going out and meeting with entities out there, but I mean, I think they are going to be looking at local sources in terms of what might be out there.
And I think what DWR has been doing is important input in terms of identifying what there's a stomach for.
Oh, sure, in those 3 planning areas where they've held the public hearings, I think that's right. That's right, but that's definitely.
Richard talks with us extensively.
Make sure.
And we envision this process here, ones where we will involve ADWR. I would much rather have a meeting or something to talk about some of these project ideas before they're finalized, to get feedback on, oh, this isn't going to work, or you didn't think about this, while we're creating those before we get to a tech memo.
So is that something that we should pose as an interim step, or once you come up with just a general project for each of the planning areas, would you like to have that come back to you just for a quick yes, no, yes, no, yes?
That's probably not a bad idea, before they do the detailed description of the project.
Because
I think that's a good idea. Yeah.
You say this is a project and 5 out of the 6 committee members don't like that, and you've already done all the detailed work on it.
Yeah.
This is Holly Richter. I just wanted to add, as somebody who's done a lot of work in rural Arizona on water, I do just want to really support that idea that at least reaching out to the stakeholders at just a really high level early on, not towards the end of the process, would be really super helpful in terms of getting the buy-in and acceptance, because, as you know, people really worry about water issues, and particularly when there's input from outside of the basin. So just wanted to reaffirm how important that is.
Okay, thanks, Holly.
Thanks, Holly.
Okay.
Okay, Richard, what's our next?
Next one. Okay, this is our initial list for how we would go about developing these. We'll work as a project team to come up with ideas. We'll look at the different planning areas. We're also looking for your input, and we do want to have early discussions as we go through to make sure that our efforts are focused where they're most useful. Any thoughts or revisions on that?
Good.
Okay. And then this 10 just captures some information that was in the tech memo that lists the revisions that we had to date on the evaluation criteria, where this is just moving various evaluation factors from one category to another to where it made sense at the time. And obviously they could change again, but this is our initial thoughts on where it might make sense to make some adjustments.
And I would just chime in that Richard was incredibly hesitant to do this, and I told him, I'm like, we're kind of just out in the dark. So these putting them in these various categories was kind of a guess, and so that's why I told him I did not think the committee would be opposed to moving evaluation criteria between categories. So if you are angry, be angry at me, not at Richard.
No, I think it makes sense that there's some of that information we're not going to know till later in the process, and we certainly don't want them doing that kind of work on every project when we don't even know yet if we're going to consider them. So it made sense in some of those more detailed criteria to wait further into the process. So, I mean, and I think we're getting comments back to Richard on possible augmentation projects. So if for some reason, if you give this more thought and see one of those you think is a problem, but I think they make sense, and I think, as Richard said, we may need to change some more as we get more detailed definitions.
On the evaluation factors, did I miss a meeting where we went through all those? I probably did.
Yeah, you probably did, because we actually did go through all the evaluation factors. And I think the problem was, as Jerry said, we kind of went through them, you know, it was let's throw everything on the table.
Okay. So we're still modifying, okay.
Yeah.
I had a lot of questions.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. So I think if there's other criteria that anyone thinks is important, there is not any problem with suggesting to Richard. And that's why I was saying that when you submit your comments on, you know, additional augmentation project thoughts, that if there's some criteria that you think we need to define differently, and there's a couple of those coming up, but we need to define differently, or that we want to move, or that we want to add that aren't there but that are kind of critical, I think that's fine. Because, we did have that discussion, and again, like Jerry said, you know, with the of course, the exception of you, Bruce. No, most of us in the room deal with these kinds of projects not in the trenches.
Right.
So, you know, we're throwing out everything on the table that we think might make sense to look at and evaluating. But certainly you all have experts around that may have a lot more information than we do about what would be some better criteria. Now, obviously, Corolla has come back with some of those as well. But, I mean, if there's some additional criteria we think it's important to look at, let's try and get them to Cindy as well in the next couple of weeks so we can get that going.
Only when I'm around forums do I have experts with more.
Okay, well, me too, obviously, but since you and me are it. Okay, Richard, does that sound good in terms of going on with that we'll get any comment? Okay.
And these two are we were just changing the names where we thought these changes might help us in defining them a little bit further.
But I think that first one was your comment, Virginia.
Well, that was changing renewability to adaptability. I think somewhere in our discussions at one point in time, we were talking about transferability, you know, between areas. Like if we come up with a great idea for one area, how easily can we use that in other places? But I think the matrix
takes care of that. Took a look at that. Yeah.
And so my comment earlier was conservation. That is something that's transferable everywhere, but to what extent?
Right.
So, anyway, that was my 2 cents.
My only issue on the cost efficiency versus economic viability, I mean, to me, I see them as different, but both important. And so maybe that economic viability maybe didn't capture correctly. To me, cost efficiency is if you've got these three options and the cost per acre foot, the cost to generate X each acre foot, the ratio, that's the cost efficient part. To me, the economic viability is, but there's only 500 people that's going to be paying for this project. So is it economically viable? It might be the most cost effective at the end of the day.
But that isn't always the issue. And, you know, look at the proposed Wallapai settlement, for example, or the, or you know, ideas of getting water to the Grand Canyon for our development. You know, the assumption is that there are people who would pay a price we've never seen before for water for certain opportunities. So,
right.
So I totally agree with you. I don't actually think economic viability tells us very much because we don't know the will of the potential payers. We know in the case of maybe some rural areas and some big cities, but we really don't, we can't speak for it, what Bill Gates is going to do in the West Valley.
Well, yeah, right. I mean, some point economic viability is what a willing seller would pay. On the other hand, it is kind of important to know if you've only got, you know, if the project is X and it costs, you know, $50 million.
Right.
Today, is there anything in the local area that would indicate that is
reasonable?
You know, like, it is not economically viable for the amount of water users in the district today.
Yeah.
Which does not mean that if Bill Gates comes in with his master plan community, that it would not be economically viable for a master plan community.
So maybe another way to describe it, though, would be to, I mean, realistically, the one that we started with cost efficiency, I agree with you. I think that's very important. Economic viability, I think it's very hard to make a judgment about how much any one set of water users can pay for water at any point in time. And maybe we need to frame it in terms of what they're currently paying or something different than we assume that you will never be willing to pay.
Right, so compare it to, yeah, so say if they're paying $1 today, this is going to be 5 times, this project would be 5 times that, this project would be 10 times that. Does that, Richard?
Yeah, that makes sense, and we can do it relative to current costs.
Okay.
I was also going to point out on the cost efficiency, there's also another category that's levelized cost per acre foot, which if we use that category, then we can compare various projects, which is kind of like the efficiency you were talking about. What I was trying to get here with this change was to figure out if we define a project, can somebody pay for it?
Right, okay, so that if we do that, this is how many times your current cost, that kind of gives you that. Okay, sounds good.
All right.
Warren?
I was just going to say, I apologize, I'm going to have to head out, but I just want to say I like the direction this is going. I agree completely with keeping draft on it because there's still a lot of work, you know, because I think it's best to have a whole product done or the project completed. But I like the direction that it's going. I really think this will be useful. Hopefully the rest of the state will view it that way. And but I think it's really a good step in the right direction, and I appreciate all the work that your team has been putting on it. So
thank you.
Great, thanks, Warren. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Hi, Warren.
And the last one we've already talked about, keeping it as a draft.
Okay, so I think, does anybody on the committee have any questions for Richard? Are we okay with, go ahead.
Well, go ahead with your question.
No, I was just
I have is the schedule, so.
Oh, yep, yeah, okay, because I was going to say if we're all in agreement with the direction we've headed here, I'm not going to try and go back and review my notes and kind of touch base, but I think I know Cindy did a very good job of that, plus reported, so we'll get it right. And just a reminder to get comments on augmentation projects or additional criteria to Cindy in the next couple of weeks. And then Richard, your schedule.
You just jump to the schedule.
Next project schedule. We have nothing to do.
There you go, that one. Yep. Okay, so today's the 18th, right there by that vertical line. So we envision going away and work on project descriptions, and then we have what I'm calling a team meeting early in December. And I would think prior to that, we would be able to give you at least a list like we talked about, and this might be a meeting where our team and ADWR would get together and we'd kind of brainstorm and throw out some ideas and we'd get feedback. And then from there, then, the next committee meeting would be early in January, where you get approval then to move on to task 3, and then the duration of that will be a little bit shorter, so in early March would be when we would meet again as a committee to look at the results of the Category 1 and 2 evaluations.
Only question, so task 2, you don't see that we need a committee meeting to sanction tasks or have a discussion on task 2?
Well, we can define it however we'd like. If you think that you'd like to meet as a committee to discuss some of those well before we get to the tech memo, that's good. Or if we want to just funnel everything through
a tech memo.
Well, I was thinking what I was calling a team meeting on 12/6, we can configure that however we want. If we had that be a committee meeting, that's okay.
Yeah, I think we had
as we go, we'll be able to define a little bit better.
We had talked today about when you got the project list for the planning areas, and before you did any deep dive into defining them, that we would get back together in case there were things on that list that we definitely did not see, or there were things that weren't on the list that somebody knew.
Okay.
So I think that it would make, and I'm not sure, and if you need some time to think about it, that's fine. We don't have to schedule the next meeting. Well, we wouldn't schedule the next meeting today anyway, but I mean, if you want to go take them back and look at that and say, okay, this is when I could get that list without the detailed definition out to the committee members. And then we can from there plan like a week or two later to have the next committee meeting to review that.
Okay.
And then honestly, at that point, I think that would be more useful to have, because I know we're still like scheduled for one meeting per task, I think, would be a more useful meeting that at the end, because then if after that meeting you've got our direction as to what are the projects, then I think we can use the portal to comment on your definitions of those projects.
Okay.
Okay, does that make sense to the committee members to do it that way as opposed, because I think the more critical step is us agreeing that these projects
are the right
projects.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm good with that.
Okay, so why don't you just let Cindy know, go back, take a look at all this, based on our discussion today. Let us know when you think you can get that list out to the committee, that first shot at project per planning area, and then we'll go from there to schedule the next meeting.
Okay.
How do you intend to address all the questions?
Questions?
So far through the document. Or are you going to?
You mean these?
Well, we've listed in this document what we think our response would be to that.
Okay, so if we have thoughts on your responses, you want us to go ahead and comment back?
That'd be great.
Yes, I think that would be good.
Yeah, because I know that, Bruce, going through most of them, they've been accepted, which is why we kind of did it this way, instead of spending the time today to go through this.
Right.
But I realize there's definitely still some unresolved issues. Some of them we thought might get resolved as we move further along in the process. But yeah, absolutely.
Because my thought here is, as a committee member, whatever's in here, I'm going to have to explain.
Oh, absolutely. That's right.
So I'm going to have a lot of questions about ratings, numbers, where do we come up with that, why, definitions, all those items.
And I'm just going to say, ask Bruce Howland, he was on the committee.
Well, but I'm not going to be here, so it's going to be, no, I think that's a good point, and I think as far as because what we can do then, Bruce, is for some reason, after those comments are submitted, we don't get a resolution of them. When we do this next meeting, when we talk, because hopefully that can go pretty quick. Once we've seen that list, I think we should be able to pretty quick go through it and say, yes or no on projects, maybe we set some time aside on that agenda if there's some unresolved issues from here.
Definitely.
Does that, if we're not able through the portal thing to
Or I may want to
email
sit down
things?
with DWR
Right, sure.
and go through some of
Right,
that too.
right.
Okay.
Okay, sound good? All right.
Yeah, we're happy to work through and resolve any outstanding questions on that. I just don't want to hold up the other work we have to do because of it.
And so I would just perhaps suggest, a lot of the comments that you and I made are irrelevant comments now because of the moving of those things to different places. So, is that an effort that should happen first as part of task 2? Now what I'm seeing in my mind is like this tech memo 1 might eventually not be anything that's ever approved, but was kind of a working document. Some of it gets more consolidated in the tech memo 2, and then we had even said in the task 5, which is the final report, that any revisions that had been made would be reflected. So I completely agree that you have to understand the underlying, but so now I look at these and some of my comments aren't even applicable anymore because I made comments on things that were changing. So I mean, nothing says that tech memo has to actually ever be.
Right, it might not be part of the final report. We may have used this as baseline to establish how we move forward.
Right.
So I want to make sure I understand fully the baseline and the basis.
Yeah, right, sure. Right, absolutely, absolutely. But I think having said that, Bruce, I mean, I think maybe if you want to get together with, the jury and go through those comments, and then if they can't get, with Richard in the mix, and if you feel like there's still some unresolved issues about those underlying to understand, because I have to go out and defend this, let's put them on that agenda for the next meeting as part of, we'll have the discussion of the projects, and then we'll also have just a line item that's unresolved issues.
Okay.
And obviously, we'll have a little more detail about what those are, but I mean.
Would it be helpful to send out the revised evaluation criteria? Because I don't feel like I have a handle on it. I mean, it sounds like we've made changes today from what we have.
Right, I think you're right.
So if it wouldn't be really difficult, it might be helpful to see those.
Actually, the ones that we had here listed,
Yeah.
I already incorporated them into the.
So they're incorporated into the September.
To the tech memo, yeah.
Technical memo that went out the other day.
Yeah.
Okay.
The one that's on the portal.
The one that's on the portal. Okay, on the portal. So that's what goes for the current evaluation criteria.
Yeah.
Okay, so we go to the evaluation criteria on the portal to get our comments.
Okay, good.
All right, sounds good, thank you. And if we don't meet again until January, you won't be meeting with me, so thank you for all of your, thank you for all of your time on this project. I don't know, I'm gonna have to rope one of you into taking over, so just be expecting my phone call.
Warren's not here, I agree.
Step back.
So if we don't meet again till January, thank you all for your hard work on this, both staff-wise and committee members.
Comments should be.
And send them all to me. Okay, thank you, Richard, too, for all of your team. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Safe travels home, wherever that may be.
Cross trails.
Thank you.
Thanks, Holly.
I picked June 1st.
Oh, really? Congratulations.
Thank you.
Wow. Wow.